Hey there, Valor Kids! You're probably wondering what I've got right here, but it looks to be like a present box, and on the front it says, hooray! That's right! So when I have this with me, what are your first thoughts about getting presents? When do we normally get presents? And it's normally on occasions like Christmas or your birthday. And what makes Christmas and birthdays so desirable for us? And it's often because of the gifts that we can receive on those days, and it makes it something that we desire or long for, to have that day of Christmas or our birthday to actually show up. We want to be on those days, those holidays as it sometimes is, so that we can celebrate, receive some gifts, and get those things that we are desiring in our heart. And this actually really closely relates to what we're talking about today, about how we should have this desire to be close to God, and how God desires to be close to us. You say, well, how does that relate to gifts? And it's that desire to not just be receiving gifts, but also when it comes to Christmas, of giving gifts. We're talking about worship, and God desires our hearts and our worship, and we desire to worship God. It's a really cool relationship. So much like how we desire for our birthday or Christmas to come, because it'll be a time of celebration, God also desires us to worship Him. So we'll find, as we're looking at this, that when you open the gift, you'll get this sense or feeling of happiness in that moment for what that gift is. And it's similar to how when we worship God, He gets to see our appreciation for Him, and the same thing for Him coming to us, because He desires for it. He is very grateful for it as well. So we have a heart in our box here, and I'm going to close my box because this has got glitter all over it, like many of Pastor Tina's cool things. It's got glitter just all over it here. So, but you may recognize that this heart is similar to one you have in your bag this week. Well, why is that? That's because we're going to put our memory verse on this heart. Now we're going to use both sides, so you can choose whichever side you want to start on. They're both the same. And our memory verse is Psalm 63:1. You are my God, I worship you. In my heart, I long for you. See, this is similar to what we're talking about with like Christmas and birthdays. We long for God. It's something our heart desires. It's inside of us that we want to be able to worship God and spend time in His presence and have His presence in our lives. And so we're going to write our memory verse on here. So you're going to need the heart that's in your bag and one of your markers so we can write that memory verse down. We're going to do half the verse on one side, half the verse on the other. So you are my God, I worship you. That's going to be the first side of the heart. So you, Y, O, U, R, A, R, E, my, M, Y, God. Capital G, O, D. I, which is just the letter by itself, worship. W, O, R, S, H, I, P, U, Y, O, U. And I'm going to flip it over because I've finished the first side, and I'm going to use the other side, this blank side, to finish the verse. In my heart, I long for you. In, I, N, my, M, Y, heart, H, E, A, R, T. I, which is just the letter by itself, long, L, O, N, G, for, F, O, R, and the last word is you, Y, O, U. You are my God, I worship you. In my heart, I long for you. I have this desire in my heart for God. I love when God's presence is all around me. And a great way to get there is praise and worship. And we're focusing on worshiping God this week. But one thing we need to add to this is the location in the Bible, which is Psalms. and the chapter and verse, 63:1. So I'm going to use this lower area on here to write down Psalms, P-S-A-L-M, and then chapter 63, 6-3, the 2 dots, and then verses 1. So Psalm 63:1. I'm going to do it on the other side as well. So Psalm P-S-A-L-M, and then 63 for the chapter, the 2 dots, and the 1 for the verse. You are my God. I worship you. In my heart, I long for you. Psalm 63:1. And that is our memory verse for today. Make sure you get a picture of your heart so you can send it to Pastor Tina, and that way we can know you've done your memory verse for this week, and that way you can get some cool stuff from the Bible store. Hey there, Valor Kids. We're going to be reading our Bible story today. So if you've got your adventure Bible, you can join with me on page 643 because we're going to Psalms chapter 63, verses 1 through 8. And you'll understand why I'm outside here holding the camera in the desert heat in just a moment as we read this story from David, who is hiding out in the desert. You, God, are my God. Earnestly I seek you. I thirst for you. My whole being longs for you in a dry and parched land where there is no water, which is a pretty good description, if you ask me, about Arizona. Like, he is out in the desert running for his life. King Saul is known that David is anointed to be the next king. So what's one of those things that you need when you're in a desert? Well, some water. I don't have any in my bottle here. And David's saying that he desires for God, just like his body is desiring after some water. He's saying here that in a dry and parched land where there is no water, he thirsts for God. His whole being longs for God. And so let's look at verse number 2 as I step inside to a little bit cooler temperature here. It says, I have seen you in the sanctuary and beheld your power and your glory. You see, David had the ability when he had the desire to walk into the sanctuary, actually worship God. And you'll see here, I'm in our sanctuary. And just like that, I have walked into the sanctuary. But this is something David could not do because Saul wanted to kill him. David was the anointed king, the next king of Israel. And Saul, who had gotten in trouble with God, didn't want to give up his authority, even though it was God who was the one in charge. So what does it say here? I have seen you in the sanctuary and beheld your power and your glory. You see, David had spent time worshiping God in the sanctuary. And verse 3, because your love is better than life, my lips will glorify you. What is he saying? He is saying that he will worship the Lord because God's love is better than life. Verse 4, I will praise you as long as I live, and in your name I will lift up my hands. He is still just talking about how he wants to praise and worship God continuously, even though he's on the run for his life. Verse 5, I will be fully satisfied as with the richest of foods. With singing lips, my mouth will praise you. You see, I've got some food here with me, some chips, some goldfish, and what have you. And what David's saying is, even as his body desires for food, his soul desires to worship God. So he's talking about all of these desires he has as he's running for his life, and how at the same time, to at least the same extent, he desires to have worship for God. So we're going to continue here as I pick back up my Bible. And it says, in verse 6, on my bed I remember you. I think of you through the watches of the night because you are my help. I sing in the shadow of your wings. I cling to you, your right hand upholds me. Now I've got the lights off in this hallway, so you can see it's a little bit darker. As we look down the hallway, it's not nearly as bright when I was out there in the sun. Why? Because David was talking about even when he went to bed and even in the middle of the night, his heart was always wanting to worship God. So even as he was on his way to sleep, and even as he was in the middle of the night, wherever he was camping out, in a cave in the desert somewhere perhaps, he was wanting to worship God. And that's what we're talking about this week, which is worshiping God. I hope you really enjoyed our Bible story, and we'll have some more fun stuff coming up. Hey there, Valor Kids. We're talking about worship today, and worship is a decision that we make that comes from our heart. And that's what we've been talking about today. If you recall our memory verse, we even did on a heart. So, when we're talking about worship, though, is worship just like when we have Jared here as our up on the keyboard for Sunday during praise and worship. Is worship just something you do on a keyboard? No, it's something that actually originates in your heart out of a desire to focus on who God is, those aspects as our healer, our provider, as our Father in heaven. So worship actually comes from our heart, and as part of that, it can also become music. Much like how David, when he was caring for the sheep, would actually play his harp and worship God. And it's a decision, a choice that we have wherever we are at any time, whether we want to worship God or not. It would be like if I were to come up to you and say, hey, I know you're hungry. I've got this rock here, or I've got this candy here. You can make a choice. Which one would you prefer? Most people, they're going to take the candy and they're going to choose that over the rock. They're going to make a choice that they'll take something they can actually eat over that rock, that they're not going to be able to either get in their mouth or even swallow. And even if they could, it has no nutritional value for the body. So speaking of that nutritional value, I know it's candy, it's not that good, but what does worship actually do for us? When we worship God, we focus on who God is and what His names mean. For example, Jehovah Jireh, our provider. God is our provider. And when we worship God and we focus on the fact that He is our provider, we don't think about all of those things that try and cause stress, cause worry, cause fear. Instead, we're worshiping God, and we're actually letting our body come to a resting place where it's able to focus on and stay in worship of God. And one of those awesome things about worship is, as we worship, we get a better understanding of what we want to say to God. As it just comes from our heart, these desires for worship, they'll come out of you as you're just either walking along, going shopping, in my case, driving as I'm working. I can be driving and just have this desire to worship God as I'm driving along. And that's one of those things that's really cool about praise and worship songs, is they can help us to vocalize those feelings we have in our heart about God. And when we start to focus and start to worship on God, all those worries of life don't have the ability to get in between and block our vision between us and God. And that lets our heart focus on God and not the problems on the world. It helps us to be able to seek first God and His desires, His wisdom for our life, because now we're worshiping God, we're focusing on God, and that opens up an opportunity for Him to be able to minister to us by giving us food for our soul and not just nothingness like this rock. We let our hearts become soft to the Lord to be able to hear what He's saying to us, and we don't harden our hearts as some people in the Bible did. When they hardened their hearts, they turned away from God completely. They weren't spending time worshiping, praising, thinking of, or talking about God at all. They were turning their backs to Him and not spending that time to be able to develop that relationship and learn how to describe that feeling of wanting to worship God and be able to speak about how much you love Him. Hey there, Valor Kids. I wanted to continue on the topic of worship, and I moved over here to the drum set because we've been talking about how the desire for worship can actually manifest itself in wanting to create music for God. And I will drum with my hands as I'm just out and about quite often and just get into the spirit of wanting to worship God. And worship is a focus on God. I got a magnifying glass, and you're looking and you're focusing on a specific aspect of God to worship on, much like how He's our provider, He's also our healer. And so I can just be sitting in my car driving, wanting to worship God and focus on how He was my healer. And when I had pain in the past, He was able to actually heal me and make me whole. And we actually included something really cool that I wanted to talk about. It's in your bag this week, and it's the Are You Ready to Worship checklist sort of piece of paper here. And I'm just going to do a quick overview on it. Welcoming God, being open to the Bible lessons about God and Bible characters, repenting, make sure we don't have any bitterness in our heart that will distract us. So we're not focused on any bitterness, any anger, any strife or hatred for other people. We are to forgive people. That's what God said to do. So when somebody does something and it hurts us, we're supposed to forgive them. And the next thing on here is serve. Genuine worship of God. Hear the Lord's voice, listening to Him in response to our worship as well. Invest in God. Continue to want to spend time in God's Word to learn more about Him, and praising God as well. Praise and worship go together quite often and are really cool, because praise songs can often be derived from the worship that came from someone's heart that helped them to create this song, to musically want to express this desire to worship God and focus on God, not what's going on in our world. And when we worship God, He'll help us to not fear what's going on around us. So I definitely recommend checking out the cool list we have for your bags this week so you can learn more about worship in there. And remember, worship is focusing on God, not the world around you, and that desire that you have inside you to talk to God and tell Him how much you love Him for who He is, not just what He's done.